So our next session here is Corporate Governance and Financial Accountability After the Global Financial Crisis, an update. And our speaker is Richard LeBlanc, again, someone who is familiar to a lot of us.
Okay. What I tried to do was look at the entire world and everything that has happened in the last year or two, particularly in the last 6 to 9 months. And it has been fairly rapid what has occurred. So much of this is new. My research is different. And in fact, in this journal here, which is the top journal in the field, there's a special edition on qualitative research coming out. Best practice is best practice. So everybody in the room and any organization over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years will be hit with these practices that I'm about to tell you in some way, shape, or form. The most significant change is that it's the era of shareholders, regulators, comprehensive full-service directors, and the advisors being legal, risk, and compensation assurance providers. And that may be because of a false sense of superiority, because we didn't have a banking crisis, that our corporate governance is excellent. I think we need to keep up with international developments and the pack. Otherwise, we can't stand still. We now have unprecedented regulatory activism. Unprecedented. The UK is now interviewing directors to determine their competencies. I couldn't imagine that that would have happened. The regulator is interviewing you whether you are competent enough. They've done 243 interviews, whether you're competent enough to sit on the board. That's incredible. Having shareholders as owners that are appointing directors. We almost have a government under TARP, and that sets a bit of a precedent with the government having a say. So now the supervisor is being empowered to come into your company and into your boardroom and ask for very specific documents evidencing some of the things that I'm going to go through with you. That's unprecedented. So what are other jurisdictions doing? Well, the UK Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, has come out and said, listen, this is unacceptable. Now there's a report going to David Brown in the UK that was mentioned in The Independent 2 weeks ago on diversity of UK boards. I believe that this will result in legislative changes within the United Kingdom. What has the US done? The US came out last year. Now all publicly traded companies in the US have to disclose whether they have a diversity policy. The SEC, in its wisdom, or in its lack of wisdom, depending on how you look at it, did not define diversity. That's an issue. All public institutions in Quebec, universities, hospitals, crown corporations, must achieve gender parity, I think by this year. And they're well on their way to achieving gender parity. So this is a form of a quota. And he was criticized by a certain institutional shareholder and other members that this is not something you want to do. But his frustration was, and the frustration of many women, is that the numbers aren't changing. And we do have qualified women out there. When you're interacting with a woman on a committee, the sum total of that person's experience is very different from another person. So diversity matters. Diversity matters because it impacts the nature of the decision, and particularly groupthink. And part of the financial crisis was caused by groupthink. So you now have a regulatory movement to address groupthink and composition through diversity policies. It's fairly clear that the separation of chair and CEO and having a majority of independent directors does not have a causal or systemic relationship. Some have gone so far as to say it's had no relationship between that and board performance or corporate performance for shareholders. It's done for agency theory to solve the agency problem because of the dominance of agency theory in the empirical literature. And the academics who have supported this point of view have said there's no relationship. And SOX happened, and then NYSE. The NYSE standards and the US focus and the UK focus has been squarely on independent directors and structural independence. But we know academically that this doesn't contribute to corporate financial performance. Now implemented that for all TSX-listed companies. You have to have a competency matrix. This was not the case in the US. The US has now changed its legislation and cited my work here and has changed it as effective February of 2010. Specifically, we are proposing to require disclosure detailing for each director and nominee for director the particular experience, qualifications, attributes, or skills that qualify that person to serve as director of the company. What that means is for all publicly listed U.S. companies now, this is what they have to do. Many board members did not have the necessary oversight as a result of lack of competence. We didn't have that in the banking sector because we had a competency matrix. And I know the banks have been working towards, and the competency matrix works. If you implement a competency matrix, and one of the banks that won the award today did it, and they went out and they got a woman with risk management experience in New York City of 35 years of risk management experience. That's because I had introduced the concept of a matrix. And it's not rocket science. You list your skills and experiences that you need for your industry. You fill it out, all the directors fill it out, and you get a director profile, and then you search for that director profile. But other jurisdictions didn't have this, and then the financial crisis hit. We have lack of a causal relationship between independents and directors, an over-reliance on agency theory, CEOs of unrelated industries sitting on complex banking board. The law has changed, and Walker came out in 2010 and said, when you recruit chairs of boards, you need to recruit for leadership skills and industry knowledge. And of the two, and this is behavior, leadership skills is more important because you cannot learn leadership skills. So behavior is even more important than the industry knowledge and the competency. It's better to have both. An industry person who understands banking and someone who's got leadership skills. So my prediction is that Walker, and now the UK code picked up on this, will permeate throughout the world, and behavioral governance will be more accepted. Composition. Walker has said that we need to go outside companies every 2 or 3 years for external board reviews. And the UK code adopted that recommendation. So now in the UK, every 2 or 3 years, all publicly listed companies have to go outside the company. The thought there, the thinking there is that we need some sort of independence and objectivity in terms of what questions are asked, how the review is conducted, and it's good to have an outside advisor bring that level of objectivity. When you ask questions, to evaluate the construct that you're actually measuring. Don't evaluate whether you agree or disagree with the construct, but what it is you're actually measuring. And when I did that, my data improved and my spread improved. So I now can ask a question with an appropriate scale, and I get directors across. And that provides for a more robust feedback of data and also spread directors in conversations. Best practices for risk. Here's what you need to have. Here's what you need to do. A formal documented risk appetite with tolerances, registers, and accountabilities. ERM, here's what the literature is saying. It needs to be integrated, and here's what the surveys are saying. This is not happening, even in sophisticated financial institutions. It's not integrated, it's not dynamic, and it's not culturally embedded. You also need, jumping ahead, to use technology effectively. You should not be using spreadsheets. You should be using technology at a higher level. But all that can be pre-planned, and the best boards do it. But that's not the board's job. That's your job as management, because you know the company and you know the risks. So what are certain risks, and how do we plan for these in the event that they happen? So it's okay for comp committees to retain that judgment, because if you screw it up and make a mistake, you can say to the CEO, no. You can stand up to the CEO and say, no, you're actually not going to get paid that much, because whatever reason you have, and it needs to be a justified reason, but residual discretion in the hands of the committee is what the banking regulators now want to see, left, right, and center. So regulations now are saying you actually have to have a proportion spread out, because you know what? Your actions as a manager, as a CEO, didn't materialize in year one. They actually probably materialized 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years later. So we're going to match your payout with the achievement. So you can't max out anymore, which is what happened in the financial crisis. If management comes into the boardroom and says, we will certify that these sustainability-related controls are appropriate, that's not good enough. You actually have to go out and get an independent assurance provider to provide assurance on your attestation over non-financial risks. If you want to be cutting edge, there's not a single Canadian company that does this. This is the future right here. Integrated means financial reporting and sustainability reporting. So you take your sustainability report and your annual report, and you combine them. And there's not a single Canadian company that does this, but there's about 15 or 20 companies, and it's going to rapidly